Today, we're going to take a look at the origins of modern professional wrestling, dating back to the 1920s. You know, the 1920s. Prohibition, speakeasies, polio. It was also in the 1920s that the embryonic stages of what we now know as pro wrestling took shape. That shape was formed by the Gold Dust Trio. Yes, that's probably where he got the name. The trio was comprised of three men: Ed Strangler Lewis, Billy Sandow, yes, that's probably where he got the name, who was the real-life manager of Lewis, and Joseph Toots Mondt. You might have heard the name Toots Mondt in partnership with the name Jess McMahon, who is, of course, Vince McMahon's grandfather. So when I say that the Gold Dust Trio shaped modern pro wrestling, that is to say they basically invented it. Joseph Mondt had learned wrestling from a legendary shooter of the 19th century carnival days named Martin Farmer Burns. Burns mentored the young Joseph from the ripe age of 16 years old, his youth being the origin of the nickname Toots. Burns nurtured the killer instinct of the young Toots Mondt and turned him into a preeminent shooter who could stretch just about anyone out despite his smaller stature. Side note, we're still talking about the early 19th century at this point, so that means wrestling was still basically 100% legitimate. Matches often went on for hours. Injuries were very common due to the intense physicality and length of the matches. This was a cash business where if a person didn't or couldn't wrestle, they would not be paid. Now, a lot of what I'm describing there would also later apply, unfortunately, to the kayfabe or fictional version of professional wrestling the trio would help develop. But the minimization of injuries and the entertainment value inherent in shortening the matches was a driving motivation behind the eventual shift over to a completely simulated sportive performance that was being experimented with by the time of the mid-1910s. Mondt's obvious instincts and tenacity as fostered by Burns eventually attracted the attention of the camp of Ed Strangler Lewis, who is a name I'm sure you've all heard figures like Jim Ross or Jim Cornette mentioned from time to time. Lewis was essentially the most famous, most powerful, and most successful professional wrestler of the early 20th century. So being recruited into Lewis's camp would have been not only a great boost to a promising young career, but also carried with it a level of cachet that boosted the profile and popularity of associated wrestlers. You might think of these 20th century wrestling camps as being analogous to today's MMA camps and gyms. Although it could not be denied that Lewis was a tremendous athlete, his career didn't really kick into the next gear until he began a business partnership with former lightweight wrestling champion Billy Sandow beginning in 1914. This partnership proved fruitful for both men as Lewis was world's heavyweight wrestling champion by 1917. It should also be pointed out here that this was still predating the worked or scripted form of pro wrestling as we know it today, at least in large part. An ally like Sandow, who was experienced in the wrestling business and knew how to deal with unscrupulous promoters and unruly opponents, was invaluable to the champion Lewis, as this was still a time when title changes were often disputed, protested, or otherwise called into question by jealous opponents, rival promoters, or clubs who simply wanted their top guy to hold the title. Or in certain cases, of course, a promoter may simply have felt that a certain championship contender may have been more pliable to their demands or financial needs, and therefore felt that they could profit more off of an alternative champion to Strangler Lewis. The world of professional wrestling in the late 1910s was still very much a fringe business operating in the gray area between lawful enterprise and smokescreen front for moving tax-free cash around quickly. And many promoters had ties to figures in bookmaking, gambling, or sometimes even organized crime. As you might imagine, this was quite insulting to legitimate wrestlers like Lewis and Mondt, who took pride in the proper sport of catch-as-catch-can wrestling and disliked having their talents exploited by often unsavory promoters and matchmakers. Strangler Lewis and Sandow began carefully cultivating and monetizing Lewis's wrestling career as the 1920s approached. The same way we might see a professional boxer or MMA fighter use PR firms to cultivate their image today. They were scrupulous when it came to choosing who Lewis would face, where the bout would occur, which affected the take-home pay of wrestlers, and who the promoter was, which could of course color Lewis's reputation by association, be it positively or negatively. By the early 1920s, Sandow had been searching for a suitable sparring partner and sometime opponent for the champion Lewis, and this is what led to the interest in the up-and-comer Toots Mondt from Lewis's camp, which was essentially just the duo of Lewis and Sandow. Mondt acted behind the scenes as an enforcer that ensured opponents of Lewis would do business the right way, not double-cross him and not cause him any injury, and would follow through on those threats if Lewis's opponent did in fact make the unfortunate choice to double-cross him in an attempt to reap the rewards and fame that came with being world's heavyweight wrestling champion for themselves. Mondt's role during this period may be compared to the one filled by The Undertaker during the infamous WrestleMania 14 main event, where he allegedly sat backstage waiting to ensure that Shawn Michaels did the right thing and lost to Stone Cold Steve Austin, thereby ushering in the most financially successful era of professional wrestling in history. But Mondt did more than just break kneecaps and snap tendons of wayward carny jobbers out for themselves. He proposed a radical shift in the sport that he believed would revive its waning popularity to a level not seen up to that point since the early 1900s. He called it Slam Bang Western, and the premise was simple: make the matches more exciting. Although wrestling still had a certain respectability attached to it among ardent sports fans, the general public had grown bored with the grueling but slow pace of the mat-based grappling contest. This was, after all, the era of the automobile and the early days of cinema. It was an exciting and vibrant period in history for the Western world in the wake of the First World War. Yet by the 1920s, professional wrestling was still largely the same as it had been before the invention of the light bulb. Slam Bang Western would change that. Mondt's vision involved the incorporation of throws, fisticuffs, and freestyle wrestling in conjunction with the traditional mat-based catch wrestling that had been the standard up to that point. This mixing of styles made the matches more exciting and created a wider variety of situations and scenarios within the matches that could be exploited or flourished upon to enhance the dramatic tension of the contest, which kept the attention of the audience for longer and allowed the wrestlers involved greater freedom to perform movements that were more in tune with what the audiences of the day were enjoying the most. Mondt reasoned that fixing or simulating the matches to different degrees could only benefit the audiences, wrestlers and promoters alike, since wrestlers at that time were still required to have a background in legitimate wrestling, so their skills as sportsmen were not being falsified. Rather, Mondt was seeking to change the manner in which legitimate athletic skills were showcased. Under this slam bang philosophy, the legitimate skills of these professional athletes would be exhibited in a theatrical or performative manner, which was designed primarily to excite the audience and otherwise elicit an emotional response from the live crowd that would motivate them to return and see future wrestling events. All of this would of course be done under a strict pretense that the entire spectacle was 100% legitimate and was the genuine, spontaneous unfolding of events in the minds of the live audience. This concept and pretense was to become known in the wrestling business as kayfabe, and is nowadays, as most know, completely non-existent outside of the actual in-universe or canon events occurring during the wrestling event itself. While today it is common knowledge amongst the majority of adult and long-term wrestling fans that professional wrestling is a completely fictitious form of entertainment presenting as a sport of competition, it was considered a crucial aspect of this new slam bang style that the fictional elements of the matches not be divulged to the viewing audience or even those in the general vicinity of the events, such as ringside physicians or venue owners. It was strongly believed at that time that the revelation of the staged nature of slam bang and pro wrestling as it would come to be known would destroy the financial viability and box office appeal of professional wrestling as a spectator sport. Let's not forget, match fixing was illegal in a lot of places, And people were still winning and losing very real money on the outcome of these now, unbeknownst to them, simulated wrestling matches. The stage was now set for the evolution of professional wrestling into the spectacle we know it as today. The Goldust Trio had arrived, and between these three men, drawn together through their vastly differing but complementary strengths within the world of wrestling, they would not only usher in a new form of entertainment and a financial goldmine, they would rule over it with an iron fist. This was only the beginning. Tune in next time if you like what you saw for the next part in our series on the Goldust Trio. Take care, guys.